There you go.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. The title of this presentation, Meet the Minds, Faculty Insights at DoctorateHub. And what we're looking at today is what is practice-based research. I'm Dr. Stephen McCabe, and I'm a mentor for DoctorateHub, but with fairly extensive experience in academia. Dare I say it, 37 years, unbelievably. I shudder when I think about that. With sort of a lot of experience in sort of what creates doctorates, and indeed professional doctorates, which is, dare I say it, part of what this is. But I will stress that professional doctorates don't necessarily always have to be about sort of professional doctorates, which I'll come back to. They can be any sort of form of doctorate. So without further ado, let's go to our first slide. So what is this about? Well, I will explain what practice-based research is, because that's important, and how it can be very crucial and a very critical part of carrying out any sort of doctor, or I've sort of said a professional doctor, which I think it's probably most suited to. And indeed, if I sort of were to summarize, if this presentation was to end in a couple of seconds, what is a practice-based? Well, it's effectively research based upon doing, and I think that's what makes it really attractive. In the sense, you don't need to set up laboratory facilities, because we work in organizations, or we largely work in organizations, whatever form they may take, and organizations are about people, and therefore we do lots of things which we take for granted. Indeed, there is a sociological expression, taken for granted assumptions. It's part of organizational culture, and people do things because that's the way it's always been done. I think quite often people don't sort of really understand, or fully understand and appreciate, the basis for the sort of the things they do, the decisions they make, and the way the processes are carried out. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is give you an overview of the sort of the basic principles of what this is about, and also the fact that how it is reliant, dare I say, upon inductive reasoning, which follows on from what I just said. This is not about sort of laboratory testing and scientific rigor and all the sort of things that go with it. It's not to say that this shouldn't be rigorous, but the sort of the idea that sort of you have to sort of create a sort of a simulated situation. It's quite precisely about what goes on and why, and more deeply and more intimately understanding sort of the nature of processes. And so, as I say, how successful research can be sort of achieved on the basis of this. Okay, I mean, without sort of reading out all this, I mean, there are a number of learning outcomes which you can clearly sort of read, and you don't need me to do that. So as you see, I mean, it'll be about sort of appreciation of significance, practice-based research, skills in using appropriate methods, because by and large, research is always about the methods you use. And dare I sort of say it, when you have to sort of to justify this, whether it's in a sort of viva, which of course is the sort of the critical element in sort of being a successful doctoral candidate, being judged by academic peers, or alternatively in publication, there is always a section where you have to sort of to describe what you did, and more particularly how you did it, and sort of provide a justification of methods, so people can sort of say, right, that's the reason for the sort of doing it. And indeed, there is a sort of a very sort of critical element, which of course is, if someone was to sort of repeat the research that you've done, would they come out with similar results? And dare I say, the caveat I would add to that is, because of course the type of research we're talking about and the methods that will be used, not necessarily, because of course this is not about sort of generalizable results, but I'll come back to that because that's an important part of what we're talking about. What I also sort of excuse me, stress is recognizing the limits of established theory. Now, what do I mean by that is that sort of we live in a world of theory, and dare I say it, we live in a world which is highly technological by and large. We press a button and things happen. We don't always understand why it happens, but there is a sort of good reason. Electricity sort of flows because, of course, that's the sort of the nature of electricity. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs and sort of the theories of sort of how you generate electricity, but we assume that these things will occur because they always have done so. We know the sun will always rise, and if it doesn't, we're in trouble. The difficulty I have is that, so when it comes to organizations, which of course is my sort of world most particularly, is that sort of we don't always know what will happen, because of course it's the nature of sort of people working together. What's great about people is that sort of they are creative beings, creative creatures, if you will. But people are not computers; they are not robots programmed to do things. We can have these irrational aspects to our character, and it is what makes working with people so interesting. But of course, you can't sort of always predict the sort of outcomes, because of course people do strange things, and sometimes those strange things lead to sort of to issues and conflict and arguments and whatever else. But what we're looking for in the sort of the aspect of sort of dare I call it irrationality, is that sort of the light bulb moment. Somebody thinks of something incredible, and dare I say it, that's the nature of the world that we sort of live in. And indeed, what I'm always fascinated by, if I may say, is that sort of what will the world look like in another 50, 100 years, when perhaps I may no longer be around? Because of course, nobody sort of living 100 years ago probably would have, well, they might have had some inkling of the sort of the way the world would develop and the technological progress. But of course, that is that's the sort of nature of human endeavor. And dare I say it, the best organizations, they work with that and not against it. Because if you try and sort of limit people's imagination and creativity, then of course you are sort of limiting the sort of ability of your organization to make progress. Okay, so moving on, it's about increasing confidence in using this method, sort of, and develop theory, which, as I've sort of said, there is explanation of what goes on, and being faithful to the accounts that you provide, which of course I think is a really sort of valuable part of organizational studies. And dare I say it, finally, to articulate the power of practice-based research to collaboratively increase knowledge, and to sort of to provide sort of mechanisms of sort of the facility, or whatever you care to call it, but the sort of will definitely sort of encourage and motivate people to work together to achieve day-to-day process much better, as well as sort of distilling this to the academic community. Okay, so that is the sort of the end of the learning outcomes. Okay, to answer the question, what is practice-based research? Right, okay, I take my sort of lead from sort of Linda Candy. You can see down in sort of the left-hand corner, I've provided sort of the reference to this, which of course, for all students or all sort of researchers, it's a valuable, well, not valuable, it's a absolutely sort of a fundamental sort of aspect of, sort of what we do. Where do we sort of get our underlying sort of beliefs and assumptions and sort of theories that already exist? So she sort of provides a sort of guide. And dare I say, I can't really sort of build upon that. It's original investigation undertaken in order to gain new knowledge, and as a means by which to sort of to achieve practice, or to understand that practice and the outcomes of that practice. So it's about sort of looking at what goes on and why. In a doctoral thesis, this is about originality and contribution to knowledge, which of course has to be demonstrated through sort of the written thesis. But dare I say, in any sort of piece of research that you carry out, you have to provide normally a written document, which of course I know that we live in a virtual world, but we need to sort of understand where did this knowledge come from, and dare I say, just to sort of take a moment out, certainly when I did my own PhD sort of a number of decades ago, what I was looking at was the sort of use of quality management, and what I was particularly interested was that what did this mean to the sort of the people who did it. I'd read lots of what I regard as sort of I suppose overly optimistic texts written by practitioners, or sort of the consultants who sort of said it was going to sort of produce incredible sort of transformation to your organization, and it may have done in certain sort of times. I should add, this was in the sort of the 1980s, when Japan was going through its quality revolution. But in order to produce the sort of high quality products, we're talking particularly about automotive and electronics, what did that really mean? And by and large, factories were still, I know that they still employ people, but they're fewer in number. It was about sort of bringing together people who carried out the processes. And anybody who's looked at this will sort of understand that if you want things done in a highly consistent manner, get robots do it. And indeed, many modern factories do that. And of course, we're probably going to enter a world where artificial intelligence will do that. But I'm still intrigued by what does it mean when you bring people together, and obviously that includes management and those people sort of working in the sort of the day-to-day sort of process on the shop floor, or out in the sort of the field, or whatever it might be, because again, I'm not limited to factory-based production. How do you sort of get them to think about what they do and to sort of to do it better. Indeed, the key lesson that I sort of learned was that if you want that, you have to really sort of concentrate on sort of facilitating sort of the latent knowledge that exists in every individual. But that is a tricky process, and you can't just press buttons. That there's a whole set of sort of other things that have to be done, other processes, if you will, to sort of get people to sort of to articulate what they know, because they know better than quite often management, who sort of are remote from what goes on and why. Okay, so I think hopefully that second point is really sort of crucial in all of this, and it's something which I would always continue to sort of to stress as being really sort of fundamentally important. I think sometimes I think management researchers that they sometimes bypass this, that sort of that you know, getting the sort of the people involved in processes is really important. If you think I'm kind of over exaggerating this, I perhaps am, but I make no apology. Because I'm also a great believer in ethnography. And this is by and large a qualitative method, which I'll also come back to, but this is about sort of getting out and dare I say, getting your hands dirty. That's a sort of wonderful expression, but you know, the idea that you can somehow find out things by sort of sending out surveys and people sort of tick boxes, or they rate sort of the on a sort of scale what they do. I've always been more intrigued by sort of, you know, you get people sort of fill a box in, you know, tell me what you honestly think. Now, of course, that's okay, because of course people write things down and you get some sort of really intriguing insights. But much better to go and talk to people and to get them to sort of tell you what they really think. You know, as my PhD supervisor used to say to me, what they think they're up to. And indeed, I sort of stress that, you know, get them to articulate it from their own perspective. And indeed, I won't go into detail on this one because it's we haven't got time. But anybody who's ever sort of looked at sort of the Hawthorne experiment, which is of course about sort of motivation, if you like, it was the beginning of sort of human relations theory, but it was effective. Well, it was quite explicitly an experiment about lighting levels. But the lighting levels were actually sort of secondary to sort of the people involved in the sort of the so-called experiment. And what came out of that is that sort of by going to people and making them feel that they're part of what goes on, a very important part, and making them feel valued. It provides a lot more than actually sort of doing things to them as if they are sort of so-called laboratory rats. Okay, I think that dare I say, the sort of the final aspect to it, I probably don't need to labour this because I think it's come out in everything I've just spoken about. But as I say, if no apologies if you think I'm sort of really sort of evangelic about this, then there is no doubt that I am. I believe it provides a really sort of fundamentally important part of what goes on and why. Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk about this in a slightly more detail in a couple of slides, but what that people shouldn't sort of underestimate is that just because this is not using positivist methods or stroke scientific methods, that somehow this is less disciplined. Because I do appreciate, and again, I did do laboratory experiments as part of my first degree, so I know how it works, and there is a certain protocol, and you follow that because, of course, that's the sort of the accepted convention until sort of somebody comes along and decides that there's a different convention, you know, a so-called paradigm shift. You do it because that's the way it works. Again, what we're talking about, because practice happens in organizations by and large, or practice happens in sort of amongst people, because we're not studying machines, because that's different. It's about deeply understanding the way we operate, and it's about sort of getting the perspectives of those involved. So in the sense then that sort of you do it in a sort of a rigorous way, and it will be about sort of documenting what you do and how you do it, because of course that would be really important in terms of justification. But again, you know, even though it seems different, and it can be sort of based upon, if I use the word serendipity, because quite often, and I've certainly sort of experienced this, and all sort of qualitative researchers who go into organizations, you go in there with lots of preconceived emotions. You can't enter in a sort of an entirely value-free way, because what is your purpose? You have to sort of have some sort of prescribed objective, and of course that's normally about a sort of a particular topic, and it might be about a sort of an issue which has been identified, of which you'll probably have done some background reading. But what I'm essentially stressing is that sort of go in and allow yourself to sort of to shift should the sort of the circumstances prevail, that you find out something which you hitherto had not come across in the sort of the written and established literature. And that's that can be a really valuable finding, because often things are written, they're sort of secondhand accounts, and they can be often sanitized, and there is a sort of a tendency not to sort of to tell the whole story, as it were, because you can't tell everything. It's a bit like a documentary. You see on TV, it's the sort of the most salacious bits. But what I'm sort of saying is that so you may come across something which you had not sort of thought about before, and that could open a whole new rich vein. A bit like sort of mining for gold. You're not quite sure it is, and when you hit it, boy oh boy, you're in the big time. So allow yourself to sort of be guided by what people tell you. And that's why I think the sort of the sociological approaches that were involved in this are really valuable in allowing yourself to sort of go out, talk to people, observe, see what sense you make of it, but also allow yourself to be sort of guided by what they tell you. And indeed, I probably don't need to overemphasize this. This is in direct contrast to what I call desk or laboratory-based research, where you are sort of, you are apart from the sort of the research. And indeed, this is why, and I've come across it, but and I'm always a bit skeptical of those people who sort of they send out sort of lots of sort of questionnaires. And of course, how many do you need to sort of get authenticity? Well, that's a sort of big question, sort of, or reliability, and all the sort of things that the expressions we get into, and the sort of dilemmas in terms of statistically based research. It's not to say that that cannot be used in carrying out sort of practice-based research. It may be a sort of element, but I would still sort of emphasize getting out and understanding and talking to people, and getting them to sort of to demonstrate it. What they understand from their own perspective is just absolutely sort of critical to this. I'm going to sort of to refer to Scrivener. This is another of the sort of the papers I refer to. That there's plenty written, and indeed it's very interesting that sort of in practice-based research you see a lot of it sort of it's orientated to sort of the arts and design, which of course is about sort of creating things. But dare I say it, and I think it's useful what Scrivener says. It aims to generate culturally novel findings that are not just novel to the creator or individual observers of an artifact. And it is this that distinguishes the researcher from the practitioner. So quite clearly, practitioners, but indeed, I do appreciate that you can be a practitioner, and of course, practitioners carry research in their working lives, because of course that's how you do things. If you've got to do something different, you learn about it, you try something and it works, and then of course it may be codified. But again, I'm differentiating insofar as that sort of the researcher is somebody who's doing it for a sort of specific purpose, and then normally it's expected to end up in sort of a minimum report. And I'm most particularly interested in those people who sort of write this up into a doctoral thesis for either a sort of professional doctorate or for a PhD, whichever of course is the sort of the program that you're on. Okay, it's worth stressing the distinction between the personal practitioner research and doctoral practice-based research. It is the form of the knowledge that the generator takes. Indeed, of course, you see here, the latter is to inform the individual organization, whereas practice-based research, which of course is what we're interested in, will be disseminated in publication, followed a structured process. And of course, particularly, again, I'm sort of giving a nod to the fact that it's more likely that you're going to be sort of doing this as part of a doctoral thesis, which of course takes its own sort of course, depending whether you're sort of full or part-time. And indeed, part-time students are sort of are always sort of interesting, because of course they are sort of those who have to sort of their primary purpose is to be at work, but of course they have to sort of somehow disengage and become a researcher. So of course there's a whole set of sort of issues that sort of come out of that, but that's perhaps for another presentation. Okay, the emphasis of practice-based research, as I keep emphasizing, it's about sort of understanding what people do, how they make sense of their situations, And indeed, what I found, and it did just to sort of say through interviews, observations, possibly surveys, which I talked before, what I certainly discovered doing my own sort of research 30 odd years ago was that sort of when you're doing it, the people you're talking to quite often they find that they're fascinated by and honoured, dare I sort of say it, and I don't mean that in a sort of a self-indulgent way from my own point of view, that somebody could be bothered to come and speak to them, that there is a sort of tendency for people to sort of be employed in organizations and to get on with what they do. And as the American expression goes, to leave your brains in the locker room. And indeed, in terms of what I was interested in, and the whole aspect was quality management and improving organizational inputs to, of course, provide a better organizational outcome in terms of the service or the sort of the product. It is about sort of getting people to sort of to do more. And indeed, we hear so much about organizational improvement. So as I say, getting to talk to people and getting them to sort of make sense in their own sort of words. And I think that's important. And there was another expression I came across, avoiding this fallacy of the condescension syndrome, which is a wonderful way of sort of saying, don't go in and talk to them like they are fools, because of course people are not. They know what they do, and they quite often know how better. And indeed, if you are to read more about sort of quality management, you'll find that this was Deming's. This is his fundamental principle. People are part, are absolutely sort of essential to sort of to organisation improvement. Indeed, as he sort of said, quality is about people, not products. But of course, ultimately they produce better products by being part of what goes on. This is why, certainly in my case, I used an interpretive approach. So, of course, what you have to then do is to sort of to disentangle it, because, of course, when you write up sort of this piece of work, you don't just, if you do it, an interview, it may sort of, it will go on for sort of many pages. And indeed, anybody who's ever done transcription will know that, of course, an hour interview can take you sort of many hours, but you can't just present everything. You've then got to sort of somehow or other, excuse me, break it down into sort of key concepts. And of course, that's where the academic aspect comes. And there is a degree of selectivity, which of course you'll have to justify either in the sort of research output, if it's a sort of report, or more particularly in the sort of the thesis that you write up and have to justify it to sort of the examiners. So practice-based research is used in creative contexts, art, music, and the media, but it can be employed in any field where people sort of carry out sort of whatever they do in terms of processes, and all the processes is doing something through inputs to create an output. And so, of course, this covers, and I've just given business, healthcare, and science. Basically anywhere that people sort of come together, which of course is the whole world. So as I say, there is kind of no limitation to wherever this can be applied. Okay. What I would sort of say is that in the first instance, what you want to do is to get a sort of a deep understanding of what goes on and why, and get, so I would sort of say is that sort of letting the data come to you. And what I mean by that, of course, is to sort of to immerse yourself in organizations. Again, I say this to students I've worked with, is that to some extent, you've used the sort of the literature and the background theory to inform you, but maybe the best thing is to go out there and sort of talk to people and see what they think are the important issues. And what you may find, not always, I accept, is that sort of the things that they're talking about are actually different to what the sort of the textbooks tell you. Because people do things and they do it in sort of whatever way that they do, and it may not sort of make sense to you. And indeed, this is often sort of the dilemma for managers, that they think in perhaps a sort of more rational, linear way than people do in organization. Although by and large, I appreciate that rationality and linearity and whatever else, that they are often sort of the way that things are done. But quite often, those people who carry out process, they have better ways of doing things, because of course they understand what the sort of the dilemmas and more particularly the impediments are, and the sort of the obstacles to sort of to achieving success, because that's what they do on a day-to-day basis. And indeed, sort of Deming, if I sort of refer back to him, because I think this is really sort of important, and he was a great sort of organizational thinker, and he founded his research in what worked in practice, was to sort of the management are often sort of a big part of the problem. And of course, it's about sort of managers are there to facilitate the sort of people actually doing things. And it's not the other way around, whereby sort of people sort of simply do what they're told, because what you then do is remove that sort of degree of autonomy, which is often really sort of important in trying to get the sort of success that you're trying to achieve. So, of course, it is also about sort of, I've used this expression before, neutrality or neutral stance and value-free as much as possible in trying to sort of whatever questions you ask. And of course, this is why in the first instance, you'll be asking lots of open-ended questions, because you're allowing people to sort of to open up the discussion and not just limit it to the things that you think that sort of you've identified in the literature, which they seem to be important, because you may be missing tricks in that sort of sense. So of course, I do fully appreciate also that sort of by doing this, it requires the organizational researcher or practice-based researcher, to give them the correct title, to sort of be willing to immerse themselves, to sort of discuss with people, and to engage in this open-ended discussion. It's not what everyone may want to do, and I fully accept that sort of. But quite clearly, if your sort of skill set is in sort of doing statistical research and you like producing questionnaires, then you will get a particular sort of set of sort of views, and it may be perfectly valid in many ways. But I think it will certainly miss a lot of the potential opportunities which will exist from being out there in the field and understanding what people do, why they do it in the way that they do. And perhaps, and certainly I sort of discover this in sort of my sort of research, that they often sort of feel that if they were asked what they would do differently, then of course they could find ways of doing it sort of far more effectively and efficiently. And indeed, that's what every organization wants to do. But sometimes the sort of the biggest hurdle to cross is management reluctance to let go and to sort of really trust their people, because people really are the sort of the best asset you have. But if you say that, you've really got to sort of believe it and do it, and allow people sort of freedom to sort of do things, because they may sort of surprise you. Okay, I'm coming back to Candy because I think it's a really useful sort of document, and she refers to sort of what's in the United Kingdom as the Arts and Humanities Research Board, which is now the Council, the HRB, a document that produced in 2000, which defined practice-based research in terms of sort of processes rather than outputs, and that's fine. And indeed, what she sort of then did is what the key features of a sort of a doctoral research proposal. And again, because I don't want to sort of to undermine this in any way, because I think it sort of says it in a perfectly sort of valid way, and I couldn't put it any better myself. But you can see there in terms of sort of point number one. So it's about sort of the research series of research questions, which is really good. They're the things that you use to get into the organisation, or the sort of the situation, if I may sort of say it, because of course it may be about a particular department, or sort of, as I say, a certain combination of sort of things that go on that you're particularly interested in, whether it's the sort of the production department or the marketing department, or whoever it may be. You're looking at, because just to add a sort of important point here, you can't look at everything, so you've got to sort of have some sort of boundedness. That's one of the things I've really sort of learned over the years, is that students can often they want to look at the whole wide world. But sort of doctoral research in particular is about sort of particular issues, so you've got to narrow it down. Otherwise, of course, you'll try and do too much, and of course, it becomes unmanageable. So defining your objectives and seeking to enhance knowledge. So it's about sort of trying to answer sort of the key questions, which of course will have sort of been the sort of the catalyst for what you launched you in the direction that you're sort of going in. And as I say, it's normally, dare I say, it's about a sort of particular issue or problem, or again, coming back to my own experience when I was looking at quality management back 30 years ago. What is quality management? What does that really mean? Because I as I say, that the objective was always about sort of making improvements and becoming more effective and more efficient, more successful, and whatever else. But how do you actually produce that? And of course, breaking it down and going back to first principles, and getting people to do things differently. And of course, we hear a lot about change management, and that is a vital part of what all of this is about. Knowing what the sort of limitations are, and working in a way which, of course, people are sort of willing to sort of be part of and to support rather than trying to enforce it on others. But I've seen plenty of examples of where people are sort of being changed, and they don't have, people find all sorts of creative and clever ways to resist change. And it makes the sort of the process of achieving what you sort of set out to do a lot harder than if you sort of working with people rather than against them. Okay, so this just carry on from Candy. It must specify a research context. So of course, clearly that's wherever you're going to do it. And I would sort of say you can do it on a number of organisations, but of course this is the sort of the salami slicing problem. If the more thinly you sort of you slice this thing, the more superficial it becomes. And I think sort of depth is often sort of a really great thing to do. But of course, I also appreciate, and we'll come back to this in a sort of couple of moments, you're not trying to sort of do something which will provide a universal truth. That's the whole aspect of science. As I say, that's the base of the sort of the modern world in which we live in. This is about the particularities of the situation, and of course, most especially the individuals involved. And because of course, and I've certainly seen this in terms of sort of my work in terms of project management, which I was heavily involved in a number of years ago, is that sort of just because you assemble a team that work together really successfully in one context or situation, it doesn't mean to say, of course, that they'll perform exactly the same way in another way, because there's a whole set of other sort of interrelated factors that are at play. And of course, that they are not consistent, that the world changes, people change, and people are sort of quite often inconsistent, because we all have this. We have good days, we have bad days, and that's part of the issue, because we are not machines. Indeed, even machines go wrong, but of course, quite clearly, if they do, you then diagnose the problem, and if it's a problem part, you stick a new one in. Indeed, there is a sort of view that organisations are much like that. If you have problem people, just replace them. But hey, that's a very negative way to sort of to review people. Maybe it's to sort of to work with the people you've got, and indeed just to sort of to add to that, the best organisations in the world are sort of full of average people. The difference is it's getting those average people to sort of to perform to sort of their greatest ability, because there isn't, if every organization thinks it's going to get the best people in the world, it doesn't work like that. We all have much greater ability than we're often given credit for. Okay, so the point number 2, of course, it's about sort of trying to sort of clearly understand why you're doing this and where you're doing it, and of course, more especially, what contribution will the project make to the advancement of creativity, insights, knowledge, and understanding, which of course is the sort of the nature of research in general, because that's why we do research, to better understand and to use that sort of knowledge in the future. And of course, coming back to sort of some methods, it is important. I think I've probably elaborated on this, and I always will do, because it is so important to know what you're doing, and the sort of the dare I sort of say it, there is the sort of the epistemology, which is a word you'll come across. That's the method, but also it comes back to sort of these are Greek words, but of course they're used quite sort of frequently in sort of research of any sort. The ontology, what does the sort of the nature of what you're doing consist of? And dare I say it, sort of one follows on from the other. Because if you're dealing with sort of people, using scientific methods doesn't always work. And again, I refer you back, if you look at Helen Schwartzman's book about sort of ethnography, and that will sort of tell you all you need to know about what went wrong, or what went wrong, but actually ultimately went right in the Hawthorne experiment. Trying to sort of use scientific methods will sort of produce inconsistent results, because of course that was the sort of the key finding. It's about understanding people, and the sort of the most appropriate methods are needed, which is about sort of in-depth sort of interviewing, and being part of the situation, and immersing yourself, and again, to use that expression again, getting your hands dirty, because you have to be sort of, if you like, part of it. There is no such thing as being the fly on the wall, because we are not flies, and flies tend to get swatted. You have to sort of to be part of it. Somebody once said to me, if I sort of put it another way, you cannot be the event, and that's often the difficulty when researchers come in. People sort of change what they do, or they clam up, because of course they feel that you might be a management spy, perhaps. And indeed, in my work in terms of team working, is getting people to sort of to be honest. It has to sort of be a no blame culture, if you like, insofar as that if managers are there, that they have to be willing to abandon their sort of their formal position to allow people to say the things that they honestly believe, because of course, if you try and ignore that, then of course you're never going to make any improvement. So it's about sort of, using methods that will allow people to sort of to articulate what they truly know and understand and believe. And dare I say it, so when you write this thing up, as of course is shown here, it's showing that there's a rationale for the chosen methods, because of course whoever looks at this will be sort of doing it critically, and they will want to understand, well, why did you do it like that? And you have to be able to provide the answers, or at least to sort of give a demonstration of why you chose that particular route. Okay, as the title of this slide shows, selecting the appropriate method. This is the sort of the fundamentally important part of any piece of research. Why did you choose that method? Practice-based research, or practice research, it eschews the belief that, I'm told, rejects the belief this is about positivism, that research must produce universal truths. Rather, it's about sort of providing, and I'll read the sort of words because, of course, they tell you all you need to know, individualized, unique, connective, and subjective responses based upon the situation in which they occur. Now, of course, I fully accept the sort of the view of some that if you sort of go and interview these people a week later, they might say something different. But hey, that's the sort of the nature of people. But of course, people then, what's the alternative? You use a questionnaire, and they fill in the questionnaire differently. But of course, that's nature. But by and large, I think that sort of when you're with people for a sort of a longer period, and of course, I appreciate it'll take a longer period than sort of maybe going in for one afternoon, perhaps. You get to know what the realities are, and indeed, people, they have no particular sort of incentive to tell you lies. Why would they? They want to tell you the truth, but of course you've got to be willing to sort of to probe and explore. It's an interrogation, if you will, of the empirical data, and it does take time for this to sort of to slowly emerge, or indeed, as the sociologists say, like, I love the expression, for the sort of the to surface the data. It's there. You've just got to sort of allow time for it to sort of to come to the surface, as it were. Okay, the researcher wishes to deeply appreciate how meaning evolves and the logic of the accounts that are provided, and because people do things and they have their own internal wisdom. It just so happens that maybe so a lot of the time they're never asked, why did you do it like that? Okay, so as such, practice-based research aims not to test theory, but to create better explanation that will establish theory. And of course, I come back to that. So I think the word, the theory, explanation that better represents what goes on and why it's a more faithful account. And if I have any criticism of a lot of the management research I've read, it doesn't. It bypasses this. It provides lots of numbers, perhaps based upon sort of extensive surveying methods and statistics and so on. But of course, you don't sort of know. Well, what are the sort of the reasons? What do people really think is going on? So, okay, and the final sort of point on this slide: practice-based research provides ways for those who wish to know how it may be possible to evolve ways to deal with the complex and complicated world we all exist in. And again, I think that's really important. Our worlds are sort of increasingly sort of complex and complicated. And dare I sort of say it, I grew up as a child, so back in the sort of the 1960s and 70s, when I was as I say, learning about the world, the use of sort of computers and phones was, that was unknown. Indeed, my period in academia has coincided with sort of going from, I never had to use chalk. I thankfully avoided that, to acetates, and of course computerization. So we live in a world now where children have known nothing but the sort of current generation have known nothing but computers. So the world is much more complex, and of course the demands that sort of impinge upon individuals, it's so much more complex, and we sort of live our lives in ways which, of course, previous generations would never have sort of imagined. But it does create sort of these dilemmas and tensions, and being able to sort of deal with it sort of successfully, or sort of to facilitate sort of people's transition is absolutely sort of crucial. And indeed, dare I say it, sort of change, and it's kind of a constant. Indeed, there is a sort of that old sort of cliche. The only sort of thing that is constant is change, and we learn to work with it. But of course, sometimes the sort of the learning, it requires a bit more pain than perhaps we'd like. But that's the nature of sort of, well, that's the sort of the duty of managers to sort of to assist in that sort of transition and to sort of make sure that sort of the most important cogs in the machine, i.e. the people, are sort of fully sort of trained and equipped to sort of deal with it. And indeed, you know, dare I say it, that's what I would always emphasize as an educationist. It's not about what, you know, we look back at what we did, because of course that's the nature of research, but we're always interested in sort of what are the skills and the sort of expertise that we'll have to sort of to give people to sort of cope with the next levels of change, whatever that may be. And there may be things that we haven't even contemplated, because that's the sort of the nature of the world in which we live. Okay, this is a sort of a diagram. Yeah, and again, if there's a sort of a takeaway, is that sort of this neatly sort of summarizes what we're talking about, which of course, as I try to stress, you've got to identify something, and quite often in research terms, it's a knowledge gap, something that you don't really sort of know fully or fully understand. What is that's going to provide the sort of the first catalyst? Secondly, we kind of work around a systematic search for sensible answers, or sort of answers which will provide the sort of the accounts of what goes on and why, which is what I've been saying for the last number of minutes, which of course will then sort of generate and clarify study questions. You know, so again, you sort of you sort of then start to understand where you're going. Designing the study, which of course is about the sort of the methods, thinking about how you're going to best get into sort of the situation, talk to the people that you want to talk to, observe the sort of the processes that you think are sort of most key to sort of trying to supply data, because of course it's always about data that will help to sort of address the sort of the knowledge gap. Collecting this data, which of course must be done in a systematic method that of course you've got sort of control over, and of course this is about sort of recording the answers, writing up, and so on and so forth. And then of course the most important part, well, not the most important part, but a really important part of what goes on is analyzing and interpreting the results. And of course, as I said before, if you do lots of interviews, you'll get lots of data, but of course you can't just put that straight into a written document. You have to sort of take out the sort of the, as my supervisor used to call it, the sort of the most important nuggets. And most particularly, of course, this comes back to what's the sort of conceptual framework, and that also then comes back to sort of the, you know, in terms of sort of the knowledge gap that you're sort of trying to sort of to address. What is the sort of what are the issues that are sort of key to it? So if it's something about sort of people not performing well, yeah, then you're looking at motivation theory. If it's looking at organizational leadership, then of course if it's leadership theory, or if it's about sort of trying to sort of change culture, it's culture theory. So you've got to be in terms of being a sort of a successful sort of researcher and indeed student, it's being able to sort of to articulate the sort of the nature and the basis of the sort of those theoretical perspectives or concepts, and creating the sort of the key conceptual framework will be a vital part of it. But you know, quite often what happens is people sort of go from here and they identify the concepts, and as I've given the sort of the health warning, it may be only when you get to this stage that you're able to sort of really sort of provide the sort of or recreate a framework which more readily sort of identifies and sort of represents the world in which you've seen out there in practice, as opposed to sort of, if you do it at this point, having sort of read all the literature, it may be sort of different, not necessarily, but again, be acutely aware that when you sort of are out in the field, you'll hear and see things, and that will help to sort of shape your opinion. It may sort of radically reshape it in a way which you hadn't sort of envisaged in the also at the outset. And remember, it's about contribution to knowledge, and if you're sort of identifying things that are different to the way that sort of it's being sort of presented in the sort of the standardized textbooks, which are often sort of very simplified and sanitized. And of course, that's a really sort of key finding, and certainly it's the sort of thing that will impress the examiners, and certainly impress me if I were examining a piece of work. And of course, the other thing about this is this is not the sort of fire and forget, which quite often sort of researchers seem to be. It's about sort of the implementation. Quite often, of course, you know, practice-based research is about sort of, you know, making improvements, and of course being able to sort of continue to monitor it and then feed this back into the sort of the research, which will allow you to provide a sort of a much fuller and more exhaustive account of what went on, why, how it sort of then changed practice. And of course, if you're able to do things which of course absolutely demonstrate that sort of by doing this, it made positive changes to the outputs. Then of course that makes the sort of piece of work even more valuable. And of course that's the whole aspect of practice-based research. And indeed, just also to add the sort of the important caveat that it's about understanding the things that sort of didn't go so well. And indeed, because time doesn't limit, but there are loads of great examples of sort of things that were sort of tried, it didn't work, and it produced a whole sort of other paradoxically sort of but this is the paradox of unintended consequences. It may produce things that are sort of problematic, but dare I say it, learning from sort of the mistakes or things that go wrong is as valuable as learning sort of the things that sort of go well. And it is the whole sort of gamut of sort of just learning about what people did, and it comes back also to sort of this problem. I think is often sort of an issue with management. They think they've got the answer, and wherever they've got it from is that's maybe their business, but perhaps they've brought in management consultants who've told them to do it like this, and it may work perfectly well, but quite often some of the most disastrous situations or problems are caused by sort of management implementing something without really fully understanding the sort of potential consequences of what they did and why it makes things worse and not better. Working with your people rather than against them, or doing things to them is I think sort of it's so much better way of doing it. As I'm very much a Deming disciple in this sort of sense, and of course that's not being sort of disrespectful, because that's what they used to be called when Deming was alive. Insofar as the sort of the making changes is really sort of good. Indeed, this draws into another sort of approach, which I really like, action-based research. And of course, I'm not sort of precluding any sort of method that you believe gets you to sort of the answers that you want, which is to more deeply understand what's going on and why, and in terms of making improvements, what is the sort of best way to achieve in this particular situation. And again, I also add the sort of the important sort of caveat to that just because it worked in this situation doesn't mean to say it works elsewhere. But of course, the valuable learning is that sort of that when you do things in a particular way and do it in a sort of consensus and collaborative way, that's often sort of the best way to achieve success. Okay, I mean, this slide here, what does this mean? It brings us back to, as I call it, the epistemological divide between those who understand the world via the rational scientific sense, okay, and this is the sort of the scientists of this world, and as opposed to those who understand the world is built on or of individualistic experiences, which are relational and constantly changing to form meaning and new possibility. And what does that mean? That sort of organizations that people change, personnel change, and teams come together, teams disperse, and that's the sort of the ebb and flow. Again, certainly in my professional life, what I'm doing now is very different to what I was doing 30 odd years ago when I first started in academia, because that's the sort of the nature of it. But as I say, that the world, it's full of rational sort of solutions to our problems. And indeed, we hear lots about AI, but of course that will have a very big impact upon sort of the sociological aspects or the social issues of organizations and how people work together, and the sort of the communities that we sort of build, and so on and so forth. So again, it's kind of a re-emphasization, if you like. Practice-based research, or practice research, is a methodology in which knowledge is gained by the doing of something rather than reading about it or inquiring what other people know. So it is, as again, to say, it's about sort of the using sort of methods such as case studies, ethnographies, interviews, whatever methods that allow you to get in there, talk to people, perhaps participate. Participative action-based research is a really good way of doing it. But obviously, the sort of thing is that you're doing and recording at the same time, which I know is a sort of that can provide quite a lot of stress, because of course you then either got to sort of provide contemporaneous accounts through sort of recording, or to write up the sort of the account as soon as possible, because of course accuracy is all important. But again, most importantly, the thing about sort of this approach is to sort of to get in there and be willing to sort of see it from the sort of the down on the ground. So this is not, as I say, about the sort of the bird's eye view or the fly on the wall, or sort of being sort of outside of the situation as much as possible to be part of it. And of course, this is what makes it sort of really valuable for people in practice to sort of as I say, to adopt a new sort of way of thinking, if you like, in terms of sort of trying to answer the questions that are sort of on their mind, but doing it through the sort of the process of completing a sort of a published piece of work, such as a doctorate. Okay, this kind of summarizes the previous slide. So rationalist, deductive approach, believing that reasoning is based from general premises, known or presumed, and through rigorous testing to arrive at more specific and universal conclusions. So, as I say, in the world of science, when we flick the switch on the wall, we expect electricity to come through it, because we assume that sort of there is a steady supply, and that will sort of light the light bulb, or sort of turn on the television or the computer, whatever it may be. Yeah, but that's how that theory has adopted. Of course, quite clear, if it doesn't, then there may be a problem. But we can usually sort of identify what it is through sort of an elimination or sort of diagnosis of what the problems may be. But yeah, that's sort of the world of science. Whereas the world in which practice-based research operates is phenomenologists who believe induction is opposite, applying reasoning from specific cases to more general, but it's important to stress on certain conclusions that are not generalizable, but it's about making sense of the sort of what comes out of the particular situation, and indeed the sort of that research and the sort of the outcomes of it stand on its own sort of merits. It can't be then applied in a sort of universal way that the sort of the first can. Dare I say, it's always useful to have a sort of a diagram so that the inductive approach, which is the sort of where phenomenologists are, observations, pattern recognition, general conclusions, as opposed to sort of deductive approach, which of course is the world of sort of science, existing theory, formulating hypotheses, collecting data, analyzing data, testing sort of the hypothesis. Does it sort of conform, in terms of statistical reliability? I would sort of say that this is where practice-based research is, as opposed to sort of this. But then there are others that might argue differently. But hey, that's for another sort of day. So what does it all tell us? Inductive reasoning enjoys a wide range of probability. It needs to be plausible, possible, reasonable, credible. The inferences drawn are sort of placed a continuing, ranging from cogent at one end to fallacious at the other. Okay, maybe sort of things you see are sort of sometimes fantastic. Some things you do sort of see incredible things, but you've got to then provide sort of accounts of that. Indeed, again, I keep coming back to sort of the Hawthorne experiment. Some really strange things seem to occur. In terms of sort of change in the lighting levels, that the theory it seemed to sort of to be conforming to, or the data was conforming what the theory was up to a certain point, and then they started changing the lighting levels down, and people were still performing well beyond the sort of the expected outcomes, and of course they then had to sort of go back and rethink it, and of course it was about sort of the people involved felt special. So, and of course, this requires us to sort of do some sort of reasoning. This is how we sort of make sense, and we provide logical accounts of what we sort of see going on. And indeed, we do this all the time. Strange things happen, and we have to sort of to work out what's going on. And indeed, the final point here: ask yourself, how do we make sense of what we do and what we see others doing? And we do this through our everyday experiences. And indeed, the people that we sort of are closest to us, they have moods. It's often sort of the way, and we then have to sort of we ask them what's wrong, and sometimes they tell us, sometimes they don't. But if we get sort of them to open up, it may provide us with a solution, which of course you wouldn't know from sort of just observing the situation. You need sort of much better sort of intelligence, and you need better sort of data in terms of those people's experience of whatever it is that's causing them problems. Okay, so just to sort of to continue on, practice-based research will not provide universal facts. So it's about sort of driving insights, individualized, unique, and entirely relevant to the subjective world we live in and operate, and we live in, and to sort of to continue the sentence, to operate in our taken for granted everyday lives. We take so much for granted until something sort of goes wrong. And then, of course, we have to sort of to stop. And of course, as we know, and we've been through the sort of the pandemic in the last couple of years, and of course, that sort of made us think about sort of what we did. And some people have decided they didn't want to continue in terms of what's euphemistically referred to as the rat race. They decided that life is about sort of something different than sort of simply working. But okay, so as such, practice-based research is extremely valuable in revealing and surfacing knowledge that will provide understanding of how complicated the everyday world is and how we cope. And I think that is an important part of what this is about. And hopefully, I've keep emphasizing, because of course it is key to success. So, I mean, we're drawn to the conclusion here. And indeed, I've said this umpteen times by now, but social situations where we operate together or cooperate, which of course is about organizations, it's not sort of by random. If we're part of a sort of a sports team, for instance, we come together for a particular objective. The team is about winning. What I'm essentially saying is that sort of there is unlimited potential, because there are so many different social situations in which we operate, and of course in which we also work largely. But of course, there are things which we don't perhaps fully understand, and we see issues and problems which are not sort of properly solved. So that's the sort of the basis upon which you sort of develop the sort of the research approach that you're interested in. So take that sort of intrigue and then package it. And then, as I've sort of given the example here, why is an organizational department underperforming? And of course, the thing about that is that sort of, as I would also say, well, what does that mean? Who says it's underperforming? Quite often it's maybe sort of management, but what metrics do they use? Who decides what's relevant? So it is really trying to sort of to delve deeper into what's going on and getting better understanding from all perspectives, as I say, because the management have a sort of role in this process, but of course the people involved have a sort of role. And it may be, once you start sort of digging into this and sort of surfacing sort of the empirical data, you find out sort of people or those involved in sort of processes, maybe they feel that they're sort of their feelings are being ignored, or sort of they're not being consulted, or there's a whole sort of range of things that will only sort of become apparent when you get in there and start sort of doing sort of practice-based research, by sort of understanding what it is that they want to do and how they think things can be done better. And that's how practice evolves and develops and becomes, dare I say it, more successful. Excuse me. Is potential change possible based upon a consensual solution? Which, of course, this is the sort of the principle of sort of action research, and it's a really powerful sort of way, if you like, of doing organizational research, or practice-based organizational research, if you want to use all the sort of the words. But most importantly, greater focus on participants allows voices to emerge from the data. As I say, giving sort of the power of these people to sort of be heard, and to sort of to make the sort of the research based upon what they do in terms of carrying out their practices and how they believe perhaps that sort of things can be done sort of differently and more successfully and efficiently, is really sort of valuable in all of this. Okay, we're coming to the end of this, thinking about or the relevance, dare I say, of a sort of a practice-based doctorate. So this is a doctorate which is achieved through the sort of the discipline research process and submitted for a viva voce, the examination at the end, and it will require demonstration of original contribution to the subject or field. But of course, why do you do that? Well, you have to sort of to show what your sort of contribution to extant knowledge is, because of course that's the sort of the criteria, that's the acid test of a doctorate. But by sort of being into organization or being into a situation, whatever that may be, and doing the sort of or doing the things which I've talked about for the sort of the last hour in terms of a practice-based approach, and showing how sort of what you've done has surfaced this new knowledge and got people to think differently, and indeed you're able to sort of to challenge and critique existing sort of theory, will be sort of really sort of valuable. And indeed, obviously, in terms of getting the doctorate, but also it will then allow you to publish this and to sort of to inform other people. And indeed, sort of there's a huge amount of work done sort of by ethnographers. I'm thinking of sort of Tony Watson's work, and the book that he sort of produced, In Search of Management, which of course was a sort of a faux sort of a homage to sort of to In Search of Excellence, which of course is the sort of the most famous book, or the most successful, dare I say, but of course it is pretty famous, carried out by sort of or written by Peters and Waterman back in 1982. And what this book purported to do was to sort of provide sort of the fundamental principles of what excellent organizations were. But just as a kind of sort of a footnote, the research which they carried out when they were part of McKinsey, which they had these excellent organizations, half of them went bankrupt shortly after the book was published. So they were excellent, but they were not excellent forever, so which demonstrates something. But of course, what I'm coming back to, or at least would like to sort of stress, is that what Tony Watson sort of did was to sort of go in and go into an organization and show that sort of there's a whole lot of complex things going on, but he did it by sort of doing sort of in-depth ethnography and lots of, sort of interview data of what people told him, of what went on and why. You know, it's still a sort of great book, and I regularly sort of get out to sort of consult it, and I would urge you to do similarly. But there's lots of other sort of really great books about organizational ethnography if you're so interested. Okay, to continue, so it includes substantial contextualization of the research, which of course is, you know, why you're doing this, what's the background sort of to the sort of the work, and indeed more particularly, of course, you know, what is the sort of the conceptual sort of aspects to this. And again, I would sort of stress that sort of they may seem clear at the outset, but don't be surprised if perhaps in the sort of the process of carrying out the sort of the research, you decide that there are sort of other things which have become more important than perhaps you sort of thought hitherto. And sort of certainly based upon your sort of prior reading, you know, allow yourself to be guided by what sort of emerges during the sort of the data collection process. Okay, critical appraise, it's about sort of clarifying the base of claim and the originality and location, but also provides the base of judgment on whether scholarly requirements are met. So again, you've got to recognize that sort of when you sort of produce the piece of work, it does conform to certain sort of expectations and protocols, if that's the word you care to use, in terms of introduction, methodology, literature, data analysis, and sort of sense making, if you wish, or your interpretation and conclusions. Yeah, that's the nature of any sort of doctoral piece or any doctoral submission, and that's what the examiners will expect to see. But as I say, you can deviate from it, but of course, like everything you do, if you do something which is different or radical, novel, that's perfectly fine in my opinion, but of course you've then got to justify what you did and the reason for so doing. Okay, to follow on, the previous point that was being made could be defined as the judgment of the submission as a contribution to knowledge, but of course what you're essentially doing is to sort of demonstrate your doctoral powers or doctoral levels of powers of analysis and mastery of taking existing contextual knowledge in a form that's accessible and audible by knowledgeable peers. You know, that's a fairly clever way of sort of saying, if you like, you know, basically you've got to be able to demonstrate that you can think and act and operate at the sort of the knowledge of sort of those people who sort of demonstrated themselves to sort of to be to have academic prowess. So as I say, don't sort of take those words as being sort of overly complicated. Well, maybe they are, but it's essentially sort of once you're sort of you know what you're talking about, and you've got sort of the power to sort of to take existing knowledge, to sort of critique it, use the sort of the data you've collected, and to sort of to perhaps reshape it, then of course that's a really valuable way, if you like, of sort of progressing knowledge. And indeed, I used the expression sort of a while ago about paradigm shift. And, you know, dare I say, we carry on doing things because, of course, that's the accepted wisdom. And it's only when we sort of just that accepted wisdom is chipped away, and all of a sudden we decide, there is a different way of doing things. And you know, the world is full of sort of, you know, or the history, dare I say, is replete with paradigm shifts. But of course, the only reason or the only way we can ever get a paradigm shift is to sort of to go in and engage, carry out research, and to show that there are alternative methods of doing whatever that we want to do to achieve the sort of the outcomes that we expect and anticipate. And indeed, as the history of sort of the world has demonstrated, sometimes things happen for reasons which we didn't fully anticipate at the outset, and the world shifts in a different way, and it can happen very quickly. Right. Okay. At this point, Andreas, I think I will call you in. Andreas is the sort of the Doctoral Hub founder. Do we have any questions?
Thank you, Stephen. I think there are no questions at this point in time. But let me just say the presentation will be made available for replay together with the slides in fully, but later also in parts. And with this, if you have any further follow-up questions, there's a forum space in the section of the webinars, which you can be using. With this, Stephen, I'd like to thank you very much for this very interesting webinar from today. And it was a pleasure of having you.
Okay, and of course the last slide there is just telling you what DoctorateHub is about, accredited by Malta Further and Higher Education Authority. So we do have the ability to provide sort of doctoral programs as part of the Doctoral Hub. So indeed, Andres, thank you for that, and I wish you a good day, and I wish everyone that watches this the best of luck in the future, and hope that you sort of derive something interesting. And what I would also stress, if you've got any questions, please do sort of get in contact with Doctoral Hub, and I'm sure they'll be sort of more than happy to sort of pass any sort of questions on to myself.
Thank you very much again, Stephen.